For many years, I'd used keyboard and mouse as a method of just logging onto the video game, picking up my controller, and getting ready to play. I couldn't see any other way of how I could play video games without a controller in my hand. But gaming is also about access. Special Effects is a charity that helps make gaming more inclusive for people with physical disabilities, and it also shows how important adaptable controls can be within gaming itself. It made me think differently about my own experience playing controller, and that if I mastered Fortnite on controller, what happens when I would try it and rebuild everything else on keyboard and mouse. Now, this is a very different concept for me because I had spent many years playing Fortnite on controller. I know how to fight, how to build, and how to stay calm in pressure situations. I even know how to win games using the input that I know best. Controller became second nature to me, and I never really questioned how much of my skill came from practice and how much it just came from the familiarity of using this input that I've had in my hands for so long. This documentary is about stepping outside of my comfort zone as I wanted to learn keyboard and mouse, not just to get better at different input, but to understand Fortnite from a completely brand new perspective. The reason I decided to switch was simple. I wanted a challenge that would actually test me. I've reached a point where controller just felt so natural to me, but I knew there was another side to the game that I hadn't properly experienced, and that's being keyboard and mouse. I spent so long playing controller that when I stopped playing the game, I always knew if I was to ever come back to playing Fortnite, that it would have to be through learning a new input method just so the game could feel new to me, because I just felt so boring every single time playing the game the same way I have for so many years. Keyboard and mouse is often seen as the more precise input, especially when it comes to aiming and extremely fast mechanical movement. So I wanted to see whether that would make me a better player overall in the game. At the same time, I knew this would not be an easy transition. I wasn't starting as a beginner in Fortnite, but I was starting as a beginner on a completely new input. That meant losing habits that I'd built over many years and replacing them with brand new muscle memory. This is one of the things that I was going to find the most difficult. I'd been a controller player for as long as I can remember, playing any game, every game I used to play back on my console. I started off on Xbox 360, moved on to Xbox One, even briefly played on PlayStation 4 for a bit of time until I finally decided to make the move to computer and PC gaming. At this point, this is where a lot of people would initially make the transition to keyboard and mouse, but I just loved playing controller that much that I couldn't see a way of me not playing video games, especially Fortnite, on that input. I'd spent a lot of time playing, competing in tournaments, and people I played with even said was shocked at the point that I wasn't a keyboard and mouse player. Even before I was on computer myself, I was still having people call me a keyboard player, saying I was lying and that I definitely wasn't a controller player because everyone expected controller players to play so slow and just sit there and rely on aim assist. I always found it amusing when people would make those comparisons with me because I'd always spend time being jealous of keyboard and mouse players and how they could easily snap onto players and have their whole hand to aim. As is one of the typical viewpoints from controller players. We have an analog stick, whereas they have a whole arm to aim. But the main thing that always helped in these situations was how you would adjust your sensitivity to your playstyle. I always had a faster paced playstyle, and I always just wanted to run, get in front of people's faces, so I chose a faster setting that would allow me to help myself if I got myself into a tricky situation. But as time went on, I did lower the sensitivity because it fitted better with the meta and how controller players were being made to play to get the most out of aim assist and be able to compete with keyboard and mouse themselves. I did, however, try to make a slight name for myself by playing competitions and being able to rank higher in order to prove myself as a controller player. And 9 times out of 10, if you were a controller player, you would play with a keyboard and mouse player, which is what I did. Because then within a team, you can manage to get the best of both worlds. Now, this is where I put down the controller, tilt the keyboard, and start this long process of learning keyboard and mouse. The first step was setting everything up. I had to choose keybinds, find the sensitivity that felt usable, and decide how I wanted to move, build, and edit. Even before I played a match, I could tell this wasn't going to feel very familiar. On controller, movement and actions had always felt connected in a way that I understood instantly without a second thought. On keyboard and mouse, everything had to be learned again. My hands didn't know where to go, and even simple things felt awkward. That first stage was more about survival than it was improvement. I wasn't trying to play well yet. I was just trying to make the controls feel less impossible to myself. The first few sessions were rough. I missed edits, fumbled key presses, and lost fights because I reacted too slowly. Things that used to happen automatically on controller now needed my full concentration. It was frustrating because I already knew how to think like a Fortnite player, but my hands just could not keep up with my brain. That was probably my biggest shock overall. My game sense was there, but my mechanics were nowhere near to be seen. I could see the play that I wanted to make in my mind, but I just couldn't execute it fast enough. This is where the transition became a lot more mental than it was mechanical. Every mistake felt like so much bigger because I was comparing myself to the version of me that already knew how to play. That made patience really important in this process. I started out with a benchmark on an edit course that I used to do. On controller, I could do it in a fraction of the time that it took me to do on keyboard and mouse, where it was around 7 minutes 30 seconds on keyboard and mouse. I could do it in under 3 minutes on controller. The process of learning keyboard and mouse revealed that input transition is not simply a matter of changing equipment. It requires the reorganization of habitual motor patterns, spatial awareness, and decision making under pressure. Although I already possessed strong game knowledge from years of controller play, that knowledge did not transfer cleanly into mechanical execution. What had previously felt automatic now had to be concisely planned, and this created a noticeable increase in my cognitive demand during the early stages of my learning process. At first, even basic actions such as movement, building, and weapon swapping required deliberate thought. This disrupted the fluidity that is usually associated with experienced play, because my attention was divided between understanding the game and managing the interface itself. In practical terms, this meant that I could often recognize the correct tactical decision, but I could not always execute it with sufficient speed or accuracy. The result was a clear gap between strategic understanding and mechanical performance. Over time, improvement began to emerge through repetition and structured practice. Repeated exposure to the same task gradually reduced the level of conscious effort required, which allowed certain actions to become more automatic. This was particularly evident in editing, aiming, and movement, where small gains in consistency had a noticeable effect on overall confidence. Rather than improving in a linear fashion, the process was characterized by uneven progress, temporary setbacks, and gradual consolidation of skill. This stage of the documentary is important because it highlights the relationship between familiarity and performance. On controller, my competence had been built over years of embodied practice, whereas on keyboard and mouse, I was forced to rebuild that competence from the beginning. That contrast demonstrates how closely skill is tied not only to the knowledge of the game, but also to the specific input through which that knowledge is expressed. In that sense, learning keyboard and mouse became less about replacing controller and more about adapting to a different framework of performing the same game tasks. Some important ways that I chose to learn keyboard and mouse was through repetition on editing courses and using a bunch of different methods of being able to test myself, as shown in this clip here. This is where it tells you to perform a specific edit and then will reset you into a more awkward position afterwards to do some of the same edits. I also even struggled with some of my keybinds, as shown here. I couldn't revive my teammate after he'd been knocked down because my keybinds were inefficient, and I did not realise that there was a crossover between two binds, which then caused a major problem. Over time, I continued to see more progress as I constantly went to the same editing maps and practiced the same edits in order to try and regain some speed and understand the concept of being able to move whilst editing, as I feel like that was one of the biggest struggles that I found throughout this process, was being able to use the movement keys whilst editing, where I was so used to using an analog stick movement. I wasn't so used to being able to use such linear movement that was WASD movement. There are certain options that keyboard players have learned to use an analog stick that they attach to their keyboard to keep the same movement, because it is widely known that controller analog movement is more effective than linear keyboard and mouse movement. Comparing controller and keyboard and mouse revealed that each input method shaped my performance in different ways. On controller, my gameplay felt more instinctive because this control scheme had become deeply embedded through years of repetition. Movements, edits, and combat decisions were executed with a level of fluency that came from long-term comfort rather than from conscious thought. In that sense, controller represented a stable and highly efficient baseline for my playstyle. By contrast, keyboard and mouse initially introduced a significant decline in mechanical consistency. Actions that were automatic on controller required deliberate processing, and this increased the time needed to respond to in-game situations. However, the input also offered a different kind of precision. Once I began to adapt it, aiming, targeting, and certain building actions did feel more exact, but only after enough repetition had been completed for those movements to become controlled rather than hesitant. This comparison suggests that input methods are not interchangeable in practice, even when they allow access to the same game. The difference lies not only in performance outcomes, but also in the way each control scheme structures the player's relationship with the game. Controller supported fluency and comfort, while keyboard and mouse demanded a period of reconstruction in which familiarity had to be replaced by a new motor learning. As a result, the experience was less about identifying the universally superior input and more understanding about how skill is expressed differently through each method. This is where I started phasing in-game matches to test how, from everything I've learned, I would cope with in-game pressure, because as much as I can sit there in training maps and learn the basics, nothing's going to prepare you for the real game where the decisions you make actually matter and have consequences. I was overcommitting, doing stupid edits that would allow players to just rush me and take advantage of me. And even in outnumbered situations with a teammate, we'd still lose a 2v1 because I was just lacking awareness, because I was overcompensating for my performance on keyboard, that I wasn't actually paying attention to my surroundings. Everything I had practiced completely fell apart under the pressure, but it doesn't mean everything that I did was wrong. There was still some good, but the majority of it was bad. I'd be able to get a few kills off spawn where players were caught off guard, and I'd be able to prepare myself, so when I had enough time to think about doing something, I was able to get the kill or a lucky shot. This made me realise I was definitely underprepared going into live matches. The big lesson here was simple: training maps do not prepare you for actual games. Real matches need movement, editing, aiming, and smart decisions all at the same time, and that is a completely different challenge that I was not ready for. I was able to get a few things going, but I definitely needed to go back to creative and try and find a way of practicing live game scenarios with less consequence to prepare myself for the real situations. and that is exactly what I planned on doing. With all of that in mind, I took myself back to creative, found a more concrete way of being able to practice in game scenarios and prepare myself for receiving fire essentially, because so far I'd just been editing at mindless walls that were just all in a row with no consequence of being shot, which ultimately is the aim of the game, is you need to kill everyone to win. So I found a box fighting method that relied itself around peace, taking people's walls, and then going for an easy shot, but without over peaking yourself. Because if you do miss, the bot can fight back to you and start moving around. Training like this works because it mimics real game pressure. You're not just learning movements, you are learning decisions under stress and what actually matters in ranked games and just games as a whole. As there's nothing you can do if you go into a game and you're underprepared, some person starts shooting at you and everything you learn goes out the window. So playing like this allowed me to understand that stress level whilst on a new input method, as the stress of that is nothing new to me. Playing on controller before, I'm used to working under pressure, but I'm nowhere near as comfortable on keyboard and mouse as I was on controller. So feeling vulnerable for the first time in a long time was a new pressure for me that I've never experienced before. So I had to make sure that I found the best way possible to help myself deal with that sort of problem so that it won't happen again and I can see real change come the next time I play ranked games. Just because I changed my training method didn't mean that once I'd used that method that I wouldn't go back to the original editing course ways, because there is still some benefit within that. Once I have now learnt under pressure and how to use my binds effectively, it's now subsequently allowed me to improve my speed, my accuracy, whilst doing these edit courses that I did before, and I was going through them quicker than I have ever done. I went back to that edit course that I did originally, and I even actually beat the time that I did on controller, because as good as controller is, it's not the fastest method. Keyboard and mouse is undoubtedly a lot faster when it comes to editing and builds. So once I actually learned the accuracy and how to deal with it under pressure, my times in edit courses improved tremendously. So finding ways to use in-game methods to actually improve all aspects of the game proved really beneficial throughout this period. I was feeling ready to go back into actual games. I was doing tunnels during edit courses and they felt second nature to me. I was doing them faster than I would even on controller, and how I was just weeks before. I was able to actually have confidence in my gunfights, and I was even deciding to push people with shockwave grenades and run at them instead of just sitting from afar and trying to get some easy shots and hide from real time fights. I found that certain actions on keyboard and mouse actually ended up being more feeling easier on keyboard and mouse than controller. Like things like long distance aim, I was beaming people like I never could on controller. I couldn't keep up as quickly on controller as I can on keyboard and mouse, and it offered just a completely new way of playing the game. I was so used to being a mindless W kill, relying on raw mechanics to get me out of tight situations, whereas now on keyboard and mouse I actually have to consider my actions more and come more prepared into gunfights against players. I have to take a more tactical approach. I have to be more concise, and I was starting to less second guess myself. Whereas every time before, I would think, oh, I've got to hold my mouse like this. And I was just thinking of so many different things and filling my mind up with stuff that just wasn't important at the time. Whereas now I'm thinking less about the input itself and more about the gameplay, where I'm kind of coming back to where I was on controller, but in a completely different way. So enjoying this game again, I'm kind of reliving Fortnite and learning the game once again just brought kind of a new life into me learning and playing the game once more. This full cycle moment, playing and finishing, learning keyboard and mouse, going through disasters in games, having to be smarter in practice, it really showed me exactly how learning works at this level. You don't just grind aim trainers, edit courses, and different scenarios. You fail under pressure. You have to figure out what exactly broke. Practice scenarios that mirror real games. That's where you get the most benefit, and then you come out of it and you're 10 times stronger at the end of it. So after enough focus work, a new input doesn't just become playable to you; it becomes yours and an extra asset for you. Doesn't mean now that I'll never play controller again. It just means that I'm at a better level on keyboard and mouse, and if I want to play keyboard and mouse, I can. If I want to continue playing controller, I will. I wouldn't sit here and say one is necessarily better than the other. It really does boil down to what your play style is and what you find most comfortable. If you're more thinking about you want to just get involved in the action, run in, no questions asked, then realistically, controller having aim assist by your side most likely going to be a more beneficial option for you. Whereas if you're more a strategic player and you focus and you want to take more time, but you still want to pull off the fast maneuvers, keyboard and mouse is going to line up better for you. But it doesn't mean you can't use either of them because there is still benefits to both. You can run in mindlessly if you're good enough on keyboard and mouse, but you have more of a chance of coming out worse off. Whereas controller does have sort of bailout feature that will benefit some players who want to run in mindlessly and play the game like that. It is very dependent on how you feel. I can only come here and say, this is how I found learning it. And I think if I wanted to play at a smarter level and use more thought process, I think keyboard and mouse suits me better. But if I want to just have fun and kind of not really think about it as much, controller is definitely still going to be my fail safe because it's my comfort input, but that's more on a personal level than it is practical. I think now that this documentary is coming to an end, it's important to go back to special effects work where adapting control interfaces for disabled gamers does demonstrate that input design fundamentally determines participation in gaming. My controlled transition from controller to keyboard and mouse required around 42 hours of deliberate practice. For players with physical limitations, such adaptation may be impossible without custom solutions. My experience here was elective and resourced. Theirs is more often existential. Both cases illustrate that gaming competence emerges from the interaction between player embodiment, input affordances, and game demands, a relationship special effects seeks to engineer for maximum inclusivity. This transition reshaped my entire gaming identity. Previously, I equated competence with controller fluency. Learning keyboard and mouse revealed skill as modality agonistic, transferable game sense constrained by input specific motor patterns. This challenges essential views of controller players versus PC players. Theoretically, this supports situated learning theory. Competence emerges from participation within specific activity systems. Fortnite skill is not singular but plural, expressed differently through each input modality while retaining core strategic understanding. This documentary demonstrates that input transition in Fortnite follows predictable phases: initial disintegration, deliberate reconstruction, partial reintegration, and modality specific stabilization. Controller provided embodied fluency, keyboard and mouse demanded conscious reconstruction, yielding different strengths. Neither input proved inherently superior. Optimal choice reflects individual embodiment, playstyle, and context. Special effects accessibility mission reminds us that input design determines not just performance but participation itself. Learning keyboard and mouse did not make me abandon controller. It made me understand skill as adaptation, the ability to express competence across multiple embodied frameworks. Competence is not the input, it is what you build it through. Thank you very much for watching.